Good afternoon, everybody. It seems like the spirits are high. Everybody's mingling and talking already. That's great. Welcome to the Humanities Forum, an initiative of the Humanities Program, in which we bring people from around the country, around the world, to do several things: to ask big questions, to share their work, their research, and ultimately to deepen your appreciation of the humanities. I think today's conversation will do all three things. Let me remind you of the rules around here, and then we'll get down to business. So you can expect, this is a little bit different. We do these conversations sometimes where, instead of a traditional lecture, we have sort of more of a podcast-style discussion, but we still have talk and then Q&A. So we'll be going back and forth for about the first 45 minutes, and then we'll be Q&A. Who asks the first question? A student asks the first question. So lock in, be ready for that moment. Another thing is make sure that your screens are put away. You can be fully present in the room. Take notes if you need to, but not on your devices. And the last thing is we have a reception. I don't remember if the reception is right over there or in the great room. I think it's right over here. I think it's over here. So pay no, when people start trundling food in like half an hour, pay no mind. It'll be there. So just join us right there at the end at 4:45. With that, I want to introduce today's guest. Michael Sullivan, our guest today, is a PC alumnus, class of 1988. At PC, I learned he ran track, like Tom Breen over here. He also contributed to the Cowl, like Shannon and Isabel. But in the 35-ish years since he graduated, his life has taken a number of interesting twists and turns. As we will discuss today, Michael, or Professor Sullivan, has worked to defend human rights in the midst of violent conflicts on the edges of Eastern Europe and around the world. To give you a taste, he served as the Rule of Law Director with the U.S. State Department in Afghanistan from 2010 to 2013. He worked on the language used in the Iraqi constitution that was being drafted in Baghdad in 2005. When war flared up in Kosovo, he traveled there as a human rights reporter. And he's joined 8 State Department delegations to monitor democratic elections in Bosnia, Serbia, Ukraine, Kosovo, Belarus. So basically, think about a spot where there's been a lot of conflict over the last 30 years. He's probably been there in one function or another. He received an MA in Law and Diplomacy from Tufts University and a JD, or a law degree from Northeastern. And he teaches in Law and Government at American University. And he's a member of the law faculty at the Afghanistan Law and Political Science Association, where he supports initiatives to expand educational access for Afghan women under Taliban rule. He has received the U.S. Department of State Superior and Meritorious Honor Awards and the NATO Non-Article 5 Medal for Service in Afghanistan. Please give a warm Providence College welcome to your fellow friar, Michael Sullivan. So, to begin, you were born and raised in one of the arguably safest places where a human could ever be born and raised in the history of the world, right? We're talking about like Massachusetts at the end of the 20th century. We look at your CV, Bosnia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, Iraq. The common thread that I see is places where you're liable to be blown up. Tell me a little bit about that. How is it that you chose to spend your life in these zones of conflict, in these sort of more extreme situations around the world? What inspired that?
Okay, well, first of all, and I guess the mic's working, thanks for coming out. I really appreciate being able to talk to you guys here. Thanks, Ian, for inviting me. And this format is very different than I'm used to, right? If you're doing a lecture, you can really control everything. And so this is a back and forth that's really very fun. So that's great for me. When you list all the terrible things that were happening where I went, I'd like to mention that I didn't cause them. I went afterwards. There's no connection to that. But a lot of what I work on is how people have a perspective to exist in these different environments, right? Because you're hearing about all this crazy stuff, and you're like, well, how do you exist in that? And it struck me that the way you were presenting this, you grew up in a very, very safe area, and all this craziness that's happening there. And I hadn't thought of this in years, but I think it was 1978, I went to see the Pope, because the Pope came to speak in Boston Common. It was an incredibly rainy day. And I was in this huge group of people, and I kind of knew who they were. They were friends of the family, but I definitely wasn't in my clan. But I was in the larger clan, and everyone was there to see the Pope, John Paul II. And as far as I was concerned, everyone was Irish Catholic and there to see the Pope. And we're all part of the same clan. And we're there, and it's raining, and we're waiting for him to see. And people start talking about, where are they coming from? How did they move up in here and stuff like that? And all of a sudden, someone turned and said, where did he come from? Where did he move up from? Now, I went from, I'm part of this clan, I'm part of this group, and the Pope's there, to, wait a minute, where does he fit in? And I point that out because this is how quickly things change in war zones and internationally. And so when you're talking about these places, sometimes there's just that little shift that makes them from a very safe place, a very common place, to, all-out war. And it's not so obvious. Sometimes it's like a bucket of frogs boiling, but sometimes it's a sharp turn. And I was in Yugoslavia prior to the war, and we were asking people, as we hear about all this conflict that's coming, it's never going to happen. Our families are intermeshed and stuff like that. So I'd point that out as to, we have always a way of looking back on these things and saying, oh, this is what they were like. And it's framed, right? So, when you look at these major things in history, you see, all right, well, World War II, and, if you're examining the Holocaust, well, it started at this point, in 1933, Dachau, and then, Auschwitz. But then in 1945, the war ended, right? So we know that, looking back, but when you're in it, and that's what fascinates me, what is the mindset and how people get through this stuff? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I did want to kind of put a template on it that, what I'm always interested in is that perspective. How do you get through, and what draws you to places? And I guess that's kind of what your question was. And I would say what draws me to these places isn't that I have something so special to give. I can work on, I can assist with a constitution, either whether it's Iraq or if there are states in Burma. I can work in certain situations in Ukraine where we were monitoring the ceasefire in anticipation of the ceasefire holding in Donbass and it not expanding with an invasion that eventually happened. And I can do these things, but there's nothing particularly special about me doing it. It's just that I did it. And, there's always that question of well, how do you get into this stuff, right? Even in it, not even just at the college level, anything. There are so many people, it's just well, how did you make your way into it? And I always say, you do it by doing it, right? And be well, I can't. I have a full-time job, selling mutual funds. It's okay, do your full-time job in 1 hour a day, work in this area that gets you closer to doing that. If you're interested in Bosnia, start looking at refugee things. Then start looking at your vacation time that might allow you to go there. Then look at different organizations. The first time I went to Bosnia, I knew there was an organization out of New Hampshire that was working in a train area that got bombed out. So people were living within train cars. And I had been in Bosnia before, so I knew how to make my way in, right? So
you visited when you were just traveling during college, was it?
I traveled right after college with a college classmate, and we were making our way through Yugoslavia. And there is that's one thing, and then there's but you're going to go back during the war. Well, you can get to a certain point. There's safety, and a lot of the things I've done, it sounds you're all you're attacking this stuff. But I'm quite conservative in nature, so I'll dip my toe in and slowly figure out where I can go, and then you make that move. So this is kind of the way I've approached a lot of the stuff, and then things open up. And I think, generally, I want to be in a position to help in whatever way possible. And I don't assume that I know what that's going to be in advance. When I went to Ukraine after working 3.5 years in Afghanistan, I was seconded by the State Department. And at that point, the idea was that Ukraine had requested the international community to come in, set up 10 locations throughout the country just to monitor and make sure, things didn't get out of hand. And there was already activity by, they called them little green men, by the Russians in Donbass, which you hear about now a lot in the eastern part of Ukraine, and about the locals who they could spin up a certain number of people and say, you can have your own autonomous country now, and you're always going to have people who jump on board with that. And so that was happening, but it hadn't gone into what we see now. And that was the idea that you were just trying to keep a lid on it. And that was my existence for 5 months. I was in Kharkiv, which you'll hear a lot about in the news, which is really just getting decimated. But, it wasn't bad there in other locations that we were at. But at a certain point, when we expanded into Donbass, then you're in the middle of it. Then you're, subject to rocket fire. Then you're going across, line of contact, and you're going into non-government controlled areas. So, no one said to me, hey, you're going to go to Ukraine and this is what's going to happen, right? And so like with anything, it kind of unravels. And that's the way history is too. People kind of forget that the expectation of something isn't necessarily how it turned out. The expectation that, we go into Baghdad and they're going to be so excited that we go there and they're going to turn around and be exactly like us is kind of the same expectation that Putin had when he went to Kyiv. Someone told him it was going to be a good idea and they were going to throw rose petals.
So part of what I hear you saying is you're not always sure what you're getting into when you get into these situations, and it only becomes retrospectively apparent. But, maybe you could talk a little bit more about, okay, so there you are, you graduate from PC, you travel around Eastern Europe, and you really liked it, right? The time you spent in Yugoslavia. This is what you were alluding to before the war broke out, when people said, no, nothing's going to happen here. So you fast forward 5-6 years, and there is a full-blown civil war going on there and atrocities and so on and so forth. What was it that inspired you to go over there? Not just, you mentioned that you knew how to, but tell me more about what really made you feel called to do that.
Well, it's tough not to want to go when you know people there. I think it's quite, there's quite a draw if there are things that you can do to help. And with Bosnia and with Kosovo right afterwards, I went to Kosovo in '99, and during that time, it was completely under Serbian control. And when I went in with a human rights organization, and I was there to interview doctors and lawyers who were being targeted by the Serbian police. And so I went in with one expectation. I had this huge thing. I think of Maxwell Smart. You won't get the reference here. Maybe older people will. But this huge telephone. This was my cell phone. And for it to work, I would need to have gone up onto a mountain and wired into something. It was just crazy, but I had it with me. And, you go into this situation, and the expectation is, you'll interview these people, you get documentation of war crimes. I had people coming to me a lot with photos and stuff like that, and then you leave. But I went in, and I was one of very few internationals there at the time, and then they sealed off the border. And the idea was there was going to be an operation like a horseshoe coming down from the north with the Serbs. And so now all of a sudden the situation changes, right? You have less autonomy, you have less kind of imprimatur of the international community and support, and you're all of a sudden staring as if people are in a crowd going, hey, what's he doing here, right? So, being there puts you in the middle of what I think is just kind of a heightened life situation, right? You're there, and your presence is, I think, more important. My presence is more important than anything I can do. And that's I think one of the biggest things. In international relations or engagement and stuff like that, there's a tendency that you can fool yourself into thinking you're there and you're saving them. And there's a lot of great work that's done internationally by some really great people. But I think one of the best things that they can bring there, along with their skills and stuff, and there's some very skilled people, is their presence, is their being alongside with these people. And when I was in Kosovo, it was a very dark time. It was during the Ratchak massacre, and which that led to Rambouillet, which led to the NATO intervention. But I was there in a cafe with my translator, who was a medical doctor, and with these guys just sitting there drinking coffee. And one of them said, well, it can't be that big a deal because Christiane Amanpour isn't here. And there was a little bit of dark humor, but there was like, it hasn't hit CNN's main page yet. Therefore, it's not as big a deal. And, you'll see that a lot. And you'll see also like an incredible amount of connection during this time, right? Because everyone is going through it. So normally you walk down a street here and you look at someone and that's it. But, when you're in Kyiv now and, the air raid sirens go off, I would imagine a lot of them, in the past at least, have been ignored because people get used to a rhythm of what's an actual, when an attack's going to happen and when it's not. And so there's just this unspoken feeling of people who have been in a war zone, which you get over time. And what they teach you when you're engaging in these areas is like, go where the locals go, right? Don't go to a restaurant where no one goes to. Well, it's the same with like, you don't go to an area where no locals are, because it might be that like there was a shelling recently and there's a lot of shrapnel around. And the first time there was a main shelling in Kramatorsk, it might have been the main one, I think February 2015, was...
this is in eastern Ukraine.
This is in eastern Ukraine, in Kramatorsk, yeah. And there was multi-launch rockets out of Horlivka, which is, a separatist area. And what happens is, like, you can think of, like, it being like a cylinder, the missile, and at a certain point, it splits apart, and all these munitions go out, and it's like grenades going down into the ground. So they're catching in the trees and stuff like that. And then the fuselage will come and it'll bury into the ground. And I was home at the time, and, during the rocket attack. And then I had a window on one side of my place, and I looked out, and I saw all these people coming, like all these old people. And they were walking toward my place. And so I, like, walked out the front, and I looked around the corner, and there was this huge fuselage sticking out of the ground. Now that wouldn't be so strange, but back then it was quite odd. And, one of the first things you learn is, like, when that happens, you don't go near it, because what there is going to be is usually a double tap. They'll hit it, they'll wait. They know that there'll be like a draw by people who come to see it, and then they'll hit it again. But like these people, they're just, and they were, older people, and it looked like it was just, if it was black, if I was colorblind, I'd feel like I was looking at a movie from World War II. They all had, their ushanka on, and, the babushka had their, like, scarves and their big winter coat. It was very cold, and they were walking toward this area, and all of a sudden they take out their phones, and they're all taking photos of it, right? So, like, you're still living through this, right? You're not like in a movie, and they're just like, isn't that amazing, Eventually, if that happened, none of them would be going there, right? But when it first happens, and that's what I'm saying about, like, you get into a rhythm of what is common and what to expect. And, that rhythm is something that you can't really understand when you're not in it. And, I say that about any place I've been. I've never been able to predict what the feel would be like. I'm always thinking about, like, all right, well, I remember this movie about that area, so maybe it's like that. That's about as close as I can get. But then the feel and stuff like that is a very different thing.
Could you take us to, because we want to hear more about like, what is it like, right? So could you take us to sort of on the ground, either in Bosnia in the mid-90s or in Baghdad in 2005, just to give us a feel of like, what was daily life like there? What was your experience like there?
So when I hear like what it's like, I hear what is the situation like, and then I kind of hear like, what would I be like in that situation? Like what would I do if I was in that? And I'll give you two really quick examples or stories, two vignettes. First vignette, I'm a freshman at Providence College. It's winter. And I find that two of my friends they didn't go to college. They decided to go out and be enterprising and sell T-shirts. And they were selling the Grinch with a candy cane on campus. It was around Christmas time. This was their business venture, and this is what they decided to do. Eventually, instead of the Grinch, one of them was drawing a cartoon figure. They decided to sell T-shirts with cartoon figures on it. You might have heard of it. I think it's like a $150 million industry. It's called Life is Good. All right? That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm in Baghdad in 2005. In Baghdad in 2005, there is the red zone and the green zone. Red is bad. Green's kind of bad, but not as bad as red. And that means you have more protection from international forces in the green zone, and you really don't have anything in the red zone. When you go to Baghdad, the first thing you have to do is land in the airport. So you take a plane to the airport, but you can't do a long landing path like you guys would do because you're much more of a target. So what you have to do is you come in very high, and then you do a corkscrew like this right down into the airport. So right off the bat, you're a little bit thrown by your landing. And then you go underground, and you get your personal security detail. They kit you up. They bring you along the main road, Road Irish, into the green zone where you're relatively safe. And I was working, in the green zone, but we were living a lot of our time in the red zone. And to go between the two meant you had to go from a very unsafe area to the green zone, and you had to do it without being detected, because if people knew who you were, they would blow up your vehicle. And eventually, it didn't happen while I was there, but after I was there, one of the vehicles was detected, and it was like a very, very big problem. But so in the red zone, when you're saying, what's it like? Well, if you know you're going to work that day, well, then you get dressed up in whatever they put on you. You get in the back seat. They throw mud over the vehicle to make it look used. It's armor-plated underneath. And then you drive from the red zone to the green zone. But in order to make sure that you're not attacked, you're in a bubble of other cars. So it's like, you can imagine this like this dance of all these vehicles blocking other cars, and they're all driving along. You might have an old lady's wig or whatever it is. No one looks like they're connected, but they're all connected, and they're all keeping your car in that bubble so that you're going to be safe going from A to B. And one day I was in the back of this car, and I looked out, and there was this kid, maybe like 10, 12, and he was walking with his grandmother. And, they're going along. The cars are going along. We're going along. And I look out, and he's wearing a T-shirt, and it was a Life is Good T-shirt. Now, I assume that, military probably gave them out and stuff like that. But the question of, is this irony, or is the universe winking at me, or what is this, certainly comes to mind. But then it's like, is it good? I mean, what is his life versus mine? He's going with his grandmother in an area that he knows, with people he knows. We're both used to things blowing up in the distance, and he's probably going to get food. And so, it's not the first time it struck me, but in retrospect, it's like, how are you perceiving this, and what is it that you're bringing to the situation, that other people might not be? And one of the things that I always do with my students is I talk about, there's a movie by Akira Kurosawa, it's called Rashomon. And this is, I don't know how common it is in law school, but one of the things you can do if you're teaching criminal law, if I'm doing a criminal law class now, I start talking about, evidence and how you collect evidence and how you interview people and how you explain through a narrative, during filings what happened and stuff like that. And it's important that you, as an attorney, future attorney, you have to be aware of specifics and you have to be, into this stuff. And, you can't be vague and you have to be, and all of a sudden, and I have my bag here, all of a sudden someone runs into the room, grabs my bag, and takes off. And everyone's like, well, what happened? And then you say, all right, stop. Everyone take out your paper and your pencil and tell me what happened. Tell me what I was talking about. Tell me who took what. Tell me how long did it take. Describe the individual who came in. Did he say something? Did he not say something? It's pretty easy stuff, right? Especially for law students who we're into the, it's not like some, philosophy class who they're just kind of these are people who really want to get the details, right? And you'd be amazed at how people have very distinct recollections of what happened. And that's what the Rashomon effect is. It's not that people are lying. It's that in that particular movie, like an incident happened, you have a number of people who see it, and they have different recollections of it based upon their predisposition to certain type of thinking and stuff like that. And so, that's something that really is important in kind of work in the international perspective, but it also speaks to what we bring to any given situation and, and how we define certain situations and whether, on that given day life was good or not. Who knows?
How did it change your understanding, or did it change your understanding of what a good life looks like, and also of what people are capable of? Does that make sense, the question?
Sure. I think, a lot of work I do looks at the recollection of people in extreme situations. Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl talks about a psychologist in Auschwitz dealing with how he sees things and how he gets through these things. And that's what's always fascinated me. How do you get through it? How would you engage in certain things? I think Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was here recently talking about his father's writing. He has some amazing stuff, but in particular, Gulag Archipelago talks about how he engaged with a state that was weighing upon him and what he decided in his mind he would do or not do, and where his line was in engaging on things, and whether he would inform on someone else in order to save himself. And these are just really just, they're kind of nice philosophical things to talk about until you're sitting there looking at the Pope and someone says, where did he come from? And all of a sudden, I'm not like, hey, I'm one of you. It's like, no, you're the other. And that's how quickly, things can change. And so, to think about these things in advance or as you're heading toward it, and there's so much literature, that you can look at, it's really, a worthwhile exercise to consider in advance, where your values are and how you would exist through these situations. I'll briefly note that there's this guy, Admiral Stockdale. Now, some people would remember him as Ross Perot's running mate. He ran as vice president, and Ross Perot did nothing to prepare him, and he went up in the debates, and he stood there, and he said, his line was, who am I? Why am I here? And he was an older guy, and it looked like he was actually saying, why am I here? But this guy was an amazingly accomplished guy. He was in the military. He went to Stanford and studied philosophy. And after that, he was doing a bombing raid in Vietnam, and he was shot down over Hanoi. And he was in a Hanoi prison for over 7 years mostly solitary confinement, subject to torture all the time, and this was his daily existence. This is what he lived with. This was, all of a sudden, he goes from being up there to down there in the prison. And as he was coming down, he records, and I believe he was thinking this, and the more you read about him, you say, yeah, he's definitely thinking this. He was so into like what he learned in philosophy and the Stoics and stuff that you learn in Civ, and like, all right, circle A, we know it's Epictetus, right? And it's like done. But he all of a sudden knows he has to apply this stuff. I mean, imagine yourself. You're hit over Hanoi. You're going down. I've been in Hanoi. I've felt like just imagine you're the guy in the plane, and everyone else around you are the people you've been bombing. Not a good reception. And, he is thinking, how can I use what I learned in this situation? And he did that, and he used the teaching specifically of Epictetus, which you guys will all know, from Civ, former slave philosopher, who was looking and teaching people about what you can control and what you can't. What you can manage and what you can't. Basic stuff, right? But this stuff is really necessary for you to be able to get through these incredibly difficult things. And so he was able to use that to get through that amazingly difficult time, and he was able to work with people who were subordinate to him because he was a senior officer, and work with them to manage that as well. Now, he didn't know that was coming, right? You're not going to know when really tough times are coming, but you can imagine that, for a lot of us, they will come in one measure or another. And it's not about like, you're in some war crime. I mean, it can be something that to other people might not seem that difficult. But to you, it's the most difficult thing in the world because the story you're telling yourself in your head, it's so overwhelming. And so you need to kind of like think about like how you'd be dealing with this. And, you mentioned teaching. One of the things I do is Afghanistan, I think it's the only country left that doesn't allow women secondary or post-secondary studies, no university. They can't even study midwifery or nursing. And so they're taken out of the educational system. And talk about a moment when all of a sudden it's like deer in the headlight, like I was, when people are saying, what's he doing here? They were raised, while I was in Afghanistan 3.5 years, they were raised in the idea of like women's rights, equal rights. You can learn languages, you have a future. And all of a sudden the Taliban comes in and bang, it ends. And so one of the classes I teach online with an organization is I teach to Afghan women, and it's an international relations and law class. But I teach that stuff, but really what I teach is how do you deal with stuff that's so difficult? And how do you think in advance about, like, how do you network? You can imagine, like, just anyone here all of a sudden being told you have no access to all these things. You can't leave the house unless you have a chaperone. And all these things are coming at you. And, like, you have to learn how to get your mind in a way to deal with that. One of the things I teach them is about Stockdale and Epictetus and how he was in the Hanoi Hilton. And then one day we started class and someone said, I don't know if we're going to be able to have class anymore because the Taliban's going to shut down the internet permanently. And so instead of worrying about the Taliban shutting down the internet permanently, because Epictetus tells us that's beyond our control, we looked at, well, what are they going to do if that happens? And how are they going to, like, network with each other without the internet? And what are they going to download in advance? And so, it became an action item. Now, it turned out that they were only shutting it down in certain areas, and in hindsight, they're never going to shut it down in Kabul because then the Taliban wouldn't have access to, the internet. So that wasn't going to happen. But it was a serious scare, and again, it showed, like, the ability to prepare versus randomly, Stockdale, like, having it done.
Did you find yourself having to internalize the principles of Epictetus and Stoicism as, when you're in these situations where there's a non-zero chance that you might, get blown up.
I think that, when I talk about like being in that vehicle with all those guys who are kitted up with long arms, and if anything happened, they're going to be coming out and shooting to protect me, and then I see some old lady and her grandchild. I feel that in most situations, that like I'm in a very protected position, and even if I'm not under direct protection, which was effectively Ukraine, you're in it with everyone else, and so you're in it, and it's not. I don't think it's not a matter of do you have fear or not, or do you, like it's just daily life. My friend had a child. It's a 2-year-old child. They live in a big apartment building in Kyiv, the kind you see blown up by Putin, who's attacking civilian infrastructure and civilian. I mean, that's what their military plan is now, is to go after civilians. And, he's been told by the mayor and by the president, they're saying to people, that there's not enough energy, there's not enough heat. If you can go outside of the city, please do it. And so, of course, well, who wouldn't do that? But it's regular life, and there are all these considerations that you have to take into account when you're not looking from outside and say, well, of course we'd go. And, and it's like, well, my father's on the other side of the river, and, we might go to this group, but if they get too many people, then what? So people make little accommodations, and they feel as safe as they can feel, and that's true of anyone anywhere.
A lot of the work that you've done has been in documenting war crimes. How have you seen the Rashomon effect there, and what do you do to try to cut through the differences in perception to sort of establish some sort of clear perspective on the truth?
So I recently I've been working with the Burmese, who's there's a junta that took over, and they're basically attacking the states and the people, and again they're bombing civilian infrastructure, churches, whatever they can. They have Air Force, the states have nothing, and so the people there who are on site and able to document things, I'll walk them through very specific things that will kind of make it so it takes them out of the analysis of what's happening, because you want that with the legal aspect of it. You want to have very specific, almost like checklist, and you'll read a report about this and this broke this international convention, and these people were targeted, and this was indiscriminate, and there wasn't a plan for this and stuff like that. But I think that what I try to do is have it broken up so much that it becomes more a methodical analysis of A versus B instead of a narrative of things. So, and you can see that in news articles about Ukraine. Who's writing it, and some are very, very passionate, some are very detached, some are for different audiences. And our reporting, because we were an international organization in Ukraine, our reporting had to be very specific to the facts. So I mentioned that, MLRS came from Horlivka. Well, I'm pretty sure we didn't say that in our reporting, because, that would be a deduction that would be beyond what we were mandated to do. And so you would be much more specific about this happened, this happened, this happened, we recorded that, and then someone else would be able to draw that conclusion. So, that might be, an effective answer to that, with specificity comes more of a long-term record, and then someone else works on what the narrative is. The Russians are targeting civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. It's a fact. They are going after power supplies so that people don't have power in the winter. But if I'm going to be writing about that, it's probably too early, or not useful for me to be giving an analysis of what I think they're doing. Instead, it's easier to show them with the internet. It's great to be able to show just dots along the area between Poland and Ukraine, and where these specific electric grid components have been knocked out, And you look at that and it becomes clear, yeah, of course that's what they're doing, right? So that's the difference between like gathering illegal information versus coming up with a narrative.
You've encountered a lot of people living in these living through these extreme situations. Have you gotten a sense of sort of like what, you mentioned on the one hand that it becomes just sort of everyday, and so you just kind of get through it. Have you gotten a sense of what allows some people to sort of keep their head and maintain moral clarity under extreme circumstances, and why other people can't or don't do that?
I think that I'll argue the former because a lot of things are unknowable, but there's something called the Stockdale paradox, and they asked Stockdale after he got out of prison. They said, "Who are the people most likely to make it? Who are the people most likely to be able to survive this situation?" And he said it was the optimists. And the paradox is that, you need to be able to confront these things. And if you look at Stoic philosophy, you need to be able to confront them as what they are. They exist, and there are only certain things you can do, to see them a certain way. And then you do need to be able to look at the fact that, eventually things will get better. Eventually, things will right themselves, and that's fine. But what the Stockdale paradox talks about is those people who had an expectation that something would happen by a certain date, right? That this, I'm going to be able to get through this, but we'll be home by Christmas. That line, right? And so, there's that in between area where those who have survived and written about it, would say that you need to exist. In Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl talks about getting through situations by helping other people, right? Taking yourself outside of yourself and reaching out and helping other people. Eddie Hillesum's Diaries of Westerbork, which are much lesser known, but she writes about that too, about trying to be there for people in the transition camp before she and others were sent off to Auschwitz. And it's that taking care of yourself, of course, but then at certain moments making that decision to be humane. We talked about Solzhenitsyn and the idea that at certain points he's not going to do certain things, even though he'll benefit from it. I think Frankl talks about the idea that you have every piece of bread is important, right? Everyone's starving there, and you have a piece of bread, and to be able to give it up to someone else actually gives you more benefit than if you ate it, right? And so I don't know if there's any real template I think any of the people who wrote these things would say, yeah, and it's a lot of chance. And of course, chance, when you look at the numbers, are right. But if you're trying to draw a lesson from the individuals who have written about it, I see that a lot. That that those who are trying to of course, nervously just take care of everything and do everything for themselves, it's a natural human instinct to do that. And it may very well be that works. But the idea that if you're focusing outward, if you're looking at things, and maybe even Thomas Campbell wrote about myths, and the idea people look at myths and how they see themselves in the universe. And there might be some to that too, like how people are seeing their experience. I think that's definitely true for Eddie Hillesum and Viktor Frankl and stuff like that, that they have a purpose. And that's what Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's book about Auschwitz is. It's like finding a purpose in your suffering. That's what you're doing. And, one of the classes that I was teaching on atrocities, and there's a Russian dissident, Navalny, who it's really an amazing his history, but I won't go through it. But like he decided to go back to Moscow, even though he knew it was going to be a very dangerous situation, and he went into immediately. They took him in. He was imprisoned, and when the class started, I was always saying, "What would you do? Like, does this make sense? Like, would you, if you were this guy, go back even though you knew you were going to be in prison?" And you would if you were watching a movie and you'd be like, "Oh yeah, I'd definitely do that." Like, "Oh, let me pause this and get something to eat." Because everyone's like that. Like I always think of like climbing Mount Everest. It'd be a great idea, but I'm usually in bed at 10 o'clock with a clicker. But like then it's like, well, you got to go outside, and it's like, it's too cold. Right? So we have this image of what we do, but that's very different than like when things actually come upon us and we're forced to make these decisions. And so Navalny, each week I'd have the class, and they'd come in and say, who had any good food this weekend? What'd you do? Did you hang out with your friends? It's like Providence. Where were the parties? And people would talk about that, and I'd say, cool. Navalny was in a box like this shape. He was probably, at least, meddled with the entire time. Was probably freezing, and he probably had lousy food. And I did this, by the way, on my weekend. And then the next weekend we do it the same. And we just talk about but like the idea was that like this is real world, right? It's not like something you're reading about. Like you had your week. And this guy was staying in this box that entire time. And it's a way of thinking that is an interesting exercise. Third week, the same. Fourth week, I came into class, and people were like stunned that I had like done something based upon the class, because this is when Navalny was killed in prison. And so there was this reaction of like, you're actually living through these times. We read headlines all the time, and it's tough not to like be detached, right? Because it's them and you're here. And so the idea of like going through that and making the decision to go through that is massive. And I don't know what the answer is for any of us. I don't think we'd really be able to know what we do in these situations. And that's what's so interesting to me, is that you don't know, I don't think, until you're there. You don't know until you're in these moments of extremis. But the idea of having a core set of beliefs seems to be something that exists in a lot of these writings. If you read the Sermon on the Mount, that's it as well. It's like we're not giving you a rule book of what to do in all these situations. We're saying you have to hold to certain beliefs. And so something is like, do unto others is more than just do unto others. It's like, think about your place in the universe and where you're going to engage and do more for other people than you are for yourself. And what will that do for you? And if you read that, you will see that there are certain things that you'll benefit from by not doing what's obvious, by not doing what's common. Think not for the morrow. Don't gather worldly possessions, right? Instead, you're thinking about what you can do for others. And so there's a little bit of that there as well that I'll see in different writing, but that gets people through. And, I think that's what it is. There needs to be that core sense that you build upon that's external from, what your title is or what your job is or what you have or your money and stuff like that, that you can resort to that you've made stronger in anticipation of tough times, which we all have, and not like war situations, but just everything. Everyone here is going to go through difficult times, and they'll look different. And but they're things that we as humans go through.
Something I notice about both the Frankl example of giving a little bit of your bread even when you're starving and Navalny going back to Russia is that part of what gives them meaning is that they're both things that are freely chosen, right? It's an assertion of your freedom. You're no longer suffering because something's being done to you. You're suffering because you chose something. I want to open it up for questions from the audience and not hog the microphone the whole time. So I can hog the microphone indefinitely, but I'd like to give you a chance. Joe, you'd like a question? So, no. Let's try that again.
There we go. First of all, thank you. I thought that was all great. When you're going into I think we all have the experience of like something really bad happening, kind of waking up and still like, moving your hand in the morning and saying like, oh, my hand still works. And like you wake up and you take the breath and it's like, I'm still breathing like I was yesterday. Do you get like, is there a sense in which like when you're in these situations, you do kind of cling to the things that still make you human? It's like, somebody like looks, just unironically, it's like, you look at your hand, you see your hand move and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm still human, even though I'm in this like crazy different situation. Is there a sense in which like that could, like having something, kind of said finding meaning in the suffering, but like, is there something that kind of can help ground you? Is the grounding effect, like having something to kind of keep you anchored also really important? That's like something really simple.
Yeah. I should have had a notebook because there's so many things I'm going to forget to say, but it's a great question. I was in my car many years ago, and I hit an ice patch, and I started to spin out, and there was nothing I could do about it. There was nothing I could do to control the car. And at that moment, things just kind of stopped. And I was looking at it like, oh, isn't this interesting? Wonder what's going to happen. And you hear that from other people in other, much more extreme situations. And there is that kind of disassociation from your body to whatever else is the inner monologue that's going on. And I think that one of the things that that maybe people who have studied philosophy and the Stoics perhaps would say is like, you wake up and you've gotten through it and you're detached, but then once you're out of that kind of like hazy state, you're putting a narrative onto it, right? Then it's like, that now you're in the world again. And I think the one thing that a lot of people use is, was this a good thing or a bad thing? And I think the longer that you look at things, you find that you rarely know what is good and what is bad. And, there's an old Taoish, maybe, it's a story about the father whose son was knocked off a horse, and the son was so dejected, and he was like, he had broken his arm, and this was awful because he wasn't going to help with the crops that summer, and so this was the worst thing in the world. And everyone was like, oh, this is, he's your only son. We're so sorry this happened. This is terrible. And he said, maybe so. And then the next day, the military comes in because they need to get people for war they're going to go, and they're taking all the able-bodied men, and everyone gets taken but his son, and because he can't go. And everyone's like, oh, this is the best thing in the world. This is so great. And he's like, maybe so. Well, you get the idea. That goes on and on and on. And the idea of, you've survived it. You wake up, you're looking at your hand, you're like, oh, this is, and then there's the story, and the layer upon the story is, is this for good or bad? Let's wait and see. And that's the wait and see is the same thing as that I'm talking about. You're observing yourself. And I think that, I think Eddie Hillisom's Diaries of Westerbork, she talks about, it's almost as if she's observing herself in these situations. And I think it's from her writing. She talks about the Jews in Amsterdam, and there are all these limitations being put. You can't ride a bike. You can't go out after 8 o'clock at night. And eventually you have to start reporting to these internment camps, et cetera, et cetera. And she talks about how, kind of like stately and well-groomed and how professional, the Amsterdam, people. And then she talks about all of a sudden it's as if they were on a stage, all the scaffolding fell behind them. Right? All the illusion of this is my position and stuff like that. And there was just this new reality. And so, when you talk about that, looking at your hand and stuff the next morning, I think of that. It's like, your reality is what you're telling yourself what it is. And a lot of it is just, getting your mind in a position of, accepting whatever the physical limitation is. And then, trying to keep it free from a negative story as best you can. So I don't know if that answers it, but I figure if I talk long enough, you'll nod because then it'll be another 10 hours. So thanks for the question.
So you talked a lot about perception, and I was kind of wondering, so often in the modern world, people can see the same thing and perceive something different than the person next to them. So how do you find the truth? When the person next to you sees something different than you, and you see something different than the person over there, how do you find the truth in that?
Well, what was Pilate's line to Jesus, right? Truth, what is truth? That's what I think when we look at war crimes documentation and the documentation of facts separate from the narrative around them is so important. And you'll see, the consistent splitting apart of groups because they see situations wildly different, and they attach their ego and their sense of self to whatever the narrative is. When I was working in Kosovo in 1999, I was reading a book by Peter Maas, Love Thy Neighbor, and he really said it better than I ever could, but I experienced it, and he said that you would go in to a little home, and you'd sit with the people, and you'd have some coffee, and there would be this Serbian musical instrument in the corner, and they'd be talking about their family, and they'd be talking about the Battle of Kosovo Polje and what it meant to them. Now, the battle happened in 1389, but they're talking about it as if it was yesterday, right? They're carrying these grievances because that's their identity is attached to this grievance. And Peter Maas writes that, other than the hum of the refrigerator, you would imagine you were back in 1389. And so, the idea of people clinging to their truth and truths, is a very strong one. And, you'll see that getting, a wider margin between the two and, getting quite alarming. But that's, that's kind of the need for trying to get certain, collective agreements on, what actually happened. And it's very difficult. And that's why, you'll hear about, well, that's just Victor's justice, right? And so, after an event, there has to be a real focus put on making sure it's not Victor's justice, that you're looking at both sides of the coin, that you're not just punishing people because you won, and that your narrative is not, overtly one way or the other. But it's a natural thing to certainly worry about in advance or in retrospect, as far as what is the truth of the matter. And, separate from the truth of the matter is, well, what is the meaning of these individuals, right? And so, Srebrenica was, a massive war crime, genocide in Bosnia. And people can recount that happening. And they can look at all the specifics of this war crime. And they can talk about command responsibility, and they can talk about Milosevic as president in Serbia, and they can talk about Mladic as the general there, and they talk about him as a perpetrator and what he did and how he was responsible. And the truth is that he did this. The backstory to the people who are like, yeah, but, is that he was born in a concentration camp. So if you wind the history back, people say, yeah, this is where he was born, and look what happened to us, right? So, there's how do you get to the truth? But then you'll see, sure, that happened, but what about this and this and this? And I think that's, the history of the world, isn't it? That there's always going to be, reflection on grievances that occurred and a minimizing of what one side did and how the other was afflicted. So, but, yeah, good question.
Hi. I have two questions, if that's all right. So the first, kind of going off that last question. So you said that that truth is sort of in its most basic sense objective. That you can go look at the war logs and stuff like that and see what's actually happening. So I guess how do when you're on the ground, do you think that can sway your opinion of what really happened? Sort of the opposite of a victor's history. Kind of a loser's history where just because a group is the oppressed and underdogs and trodden down, that they're on the right side of the argument, if you know what I'm saying. How do you stop yourself from that? Remain unbiased in an emotionally intense situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll answer your first one, because I'm sure I'll forget. Well, I don't want to opine. You have plenty of philosophers here about the nature of truth, and that's a long lecture that gets quite nuanced. But what you ask is really important, because what is a natural thing to do is, if you're working in a humanitarian effort and you're with a certain group, you're eating with them, you're talking to them, you're probably learning their language, you have relationships with them, you see them every day, and they're being oppressed, right? And so that's a really important thing that people in those areas have to make sure that they're not being affected by that. And it's never going to be 100%, but it really is something that needs to be looked at. And that's why a lot of the reporting for international groups, you have to be able to look at it and say it's very clear that it's free from overt bias, and that's why it's usually very specific. And so you might say that there were 50 people at a line of contact. They were crossing into one area. It took them 10 hours to cross into the other area and back. And so that's the fact. Interviews of these people and general assessments saw that most of them were elderly. Okay, you can say that's an assessment. Interviews with these elderly people found that the reason that they're all queued up to walk across the line and back was they need to get their pensions from government-controlled areas and come back, right? So you're breaking it up into things that are definitely true as far as numbers. You can record that. Other things that are probably true, but you're splitting them up. But as far as the connection to the people that you're around, it's really, really a tough thing to do, and you see it all the time. And it's a good thing for you to point out, because again, that's one of the main things, depending on what your efforts are, that you need to separate from. Some people are there purely as a humanitarian effort. They're purely on the side of people they want to that they're working with. Basically, they're bringing in humanitarian aid, and that's one effort. But the areas that we're talking about that are a little bit more separate, and reporting things are different. So it's a great question.
Thank you. And then, how did being in these like difficult circumstances, like seeing hardship, pressure, and stress firsthand, help you in your like future career in law and stuff like that?
I think that, you know, I'm usually just doing the next thing in front of me. So, yeah, I'm kind of like in that car spinning out of control. I'm just watching, and you know, right now, you know, I find that like most people, I'm pivoting to where I can be of help, and so, you know, currently my portfolio is mostly on Ukraine or Burma, Myanmar, and you know, there are a bunch of different areas that I can work in, and you know, I'll just wait to see where I can be of use. So yeah, those are great questions.
There's a lot of, you know, conversation today, especially, you know, recently in the last weeks, months, years, about kind of America's meddling hand, you know, in the Middle East or in Africa or in Indonesia or NATO's hand. I'm curious if at the start of kind of your adventures or ventures out to, you know, all these countries, if your opinion was one thing about maybe the West's hand, you know, saving hand, and then afterwards now with a developed career and developed perspective, if you've kind of changed that or evolved it, and maybe if you're seeing a dissonance between what people think is going on across the pond and what is actually going on, and how you reconcile that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely, great question. I mean, hopefully my thoughts have evolved, even if I'm not so aware of it. You know, you're talking about like the perception of our engagement, and you know, the outside perception versus what's happening now and in the past. You know, I mean, you can say, well, when I first started, you know, we could be telling ourselves the story that, well, we're trying to bring democracy to the Middle East, depending on who's in charge of that narrative, and you know, that was definitely a certain camp within the U.S. government felt that the engagement in Iraq was going to do that. There are stated reasons for doing things, and then there are, you know, other sub-reasons. Our engagement in Iran now, you could say, well, you know, we're meddling and we're doing all this stuff, but if you look in the history with Mossadegh and stuff like that, we've been involved in these places for a long time. Now, the narrative has been there academically, but, you know, most people don't think of, you know, when they think of Iran, they think of 70-net, they think of the Shah, they think of the hostages and stuff like that. But, you know, there's always going to be engagement by superpowers and overreach and stuff. And, you know, how people see themselves within that is going to be how they perceive their lives. You know, we always had like the idea of the evil empire, and like you know, the USSR, and like, you know, what they were doing in Afghanistan, and we had to get them out of Afghanistan, and supplying Stinger missiles and stuff. But I worked for 3.5 years in Kandahar, Afghanistan, and there's a book called Afghansy that talks about the Russian engagement there, and what they were doing, and how they were getting kind of academics to go and do some of the stuff that effectively, like the same kind of theory that, you know, our people in the State Department, USAID, were doing, trying to assist the local population. And you know, it's a framing. It's certainly, you know, we felt that what we were doing was going to have, you know, a benefit. And so in that moment, we're working with people trying to get a rule of law system that's more equitable. So, there's in Afghanistan, there's a formal rule of law system like you think about here with judges and prosecutors and stuff like that. And then there's an informal justice system, which is the Spingili, the Whitebeards. And these would be the older guys in the village who you'd go in and you'd make your claim and say that, my goat was stolen, and they'd say, no, it wasn't. And they'd say, all right, let's kill a goat and we'll all have a party and everything will be fine. But since you were affected, we're going to sell off your daughter in marriage to them. And so that's the informal system that we were trying to engage with. And we'd be like, the goat thing sounds good and we like the party, but the people on the other side of the mountain, they've stopped selling off women. And, why don't we get together, you guys, to talk about that, right? So, the effort, the meaning, within that moment, you're looking to do the right thing. And, as I said before, what is the right thing? History will show, what, things are going to have, good and bad results. Were you giving false hope? Now that I'm teaching, these women, was that false hope? Or what will it have, 10 years from now, an amazing result and stuff? So you don't know. So, my perception evolves in the sense that, my overriding philosophy is I don't know. And that really has helped me because I just don't. I know what's in front of me. I know, what my intention is. And after that, how things will play out down the road or what the intention of other people engaged with it, it's really tough to get your head wrapped around. And so you can do what's right. You can do what's in front of you. The same as these people who get through these things. They're doing what's in front of them, doing what's right, telling themselves, the right things, and it just going from there. And all the political machinations and what the analysis of things are by whatever talking head on Monday versus Wednesday, and people who have no need to keep a consistent narrative. They can go off and whatever. I don't worry so much about that because that'd be a difficult day to have. But really great question.
I kind of have a few that go together. Is that fine?
She has 5 fingers, so I think.
So just kind of along the same lines of Mike's question, I'm curious, if you, in your work, observed social movements in kind of restructuring law, or if you were more so participating in some sort of catalyst kind of decision that would lead to that, or if it was more authoritative. But then also, I was curious about, in your individual work, you're talking about keeping track of specificities to then use in future work and report on. I'm wondering where the line is for you, where you're being integrated but also have to be detached at the same time. Do you ever find points where you're it would be so much better if I could just jump in and also be taking action in this moment rather than documenting and reflecting later? I don't know if those kind
it's
of
the
all
right thing
together,
to do. Yeah. Well, like I said, I wish I'm gonna go with your first question. You can reword, but as far as social movements and with law and stuff like that, it depends. It depends on what your work is and how you're engaged with things. With Burma, there are states within Myanmar that have very specific ideas as to what they want to have happen. They don't like getting bombed by the junta. They don't want any part of the junta, and they want to have their own structure. And so within that state, and there are a number of states, they're looking at what their system should be and what their laws should be and how they should reflect maybe things that coincide with international norms. So these are called NIACs, non-armed. Anyways, it doesn't matter. The idea is that they're putting their society together, right? And they're working on that. So to the extent that I would be working with them, I would be advising maybe on ways they could do that better. ways that might, from experience, work out better than coming in with like, here's the solution. So in that regard, maybe, but I think it's probably best to allow for as much of an organic change as possible, except for, as I mentioned, BAAD, B-A-A-D, the exchange of like women in during these informal justice decisions, things like that. You can target and say, all right, we're going to kind of be hands off. They're going to slowly evolve over time, but this is one we want to really try to like affect. And so in that instance, depending on what group you're with and what your mandate is and what you're doing, you might have more of a specific engagement, if that makes sense.
So remember, the rule is you need to join us for the reception over here, and please give a warm thank you, applause to Michael Sullivan.